Okay, Gil, from Eretz Israel, from Israel, please put up the Torah blessing, so we could do a blessing this morning. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Okay. Baruch Hashem. All right. Yasala. We're all here. Some of this material will be new. Some of it will be familiar. We've studied this on many different levels, at many different moments. It's this year, I think last year as well, I think we had Shmini and the Shabbat of the Child kind of arrive together. And it's always good to do Chazara. It's good to do, to repeat things. The Gemara says in a number of places, you can't compare someone who reviews their learning 100 times versus 101. So even that 101st time is better than the 100th. And so there's something important about going over things, and we have repetition as part of our annual cycle of Torah learning. So we're going to learn some sources that, again, that might be familiar, and some hopefully that won't be. We're taking up the story of Nadav and Avihu through the prism of last night's sermon about neurodiversity, or about children more broadly who are misunderstood or mislabeled or misframed, or kind of, we miss the mark on them. So those of you who are online with us, you see in in the chat area, you'll see the sources both as a PDF and also as a live link to the Safari page. And so let's get going. Let's learn some Torah. Screen. Okay, good. Make it a little bigger. Roshat Shmini is begins in chapter 10, but immediately preceding chapter 10, it's important to understand the context for the text. So immediately preceding chapter 10, there is let's catch up to where we are in Torah. So so we can understand this moment, okay? So basically, all of the last maybe 15 chapters of the book of Exodus. So we arrive at Mount Sinai, and then after Mount Sinai, Parshat Mishpatim, we have Truma Tetzaveh, Kitisa Vayakal B'Tudeh. We have 5 parshiot. All of them are about what? They're about the construction of the tabernacle, right? They're building a Mishkan. They're building this beautiful portable sanctuary. And the beginning of the book of Leviticus is essentially, right, Vayikra Tzav, first 2 parshiot, which are basically the first 8 chapters of the third book, 8 chapters. What are they about? So it's ready to go, right? The tabernacle has been constructed. It's ready to be inhabited and made available to usage, right? They're going to be doing things in there. It's like, it's ready to go. They just get instructions on how to run it. And there's going to be a big celebration or consecration of this tabernacle so that it can now be ready to use. That takes place for a week-long consecration of the tabernacle. It's called the Shiva Yimei HaMiluim, the 7 days of filling in, like, oh, we're ready to go, we have a week, right? And then the Parsha picks up at the end of those 7 days with a remarkable ceremony where Aaron and Moses, they make it operational. It's almost like, like they smash the champagne against the side of the, let's see what it can really do, let's give it a run. And they give it a run, and at the end of chapter 9, which again, there has been a 7-day special week-long celebration and consecration and usage of the tabernacle, it works. It's like, whoa, it works. Like, look what happens, right? That they put all of the they put it all of the final, slaughtered animal. That was their technology of prayer, right? It was almost like imagine prayer, but in that day that was their technology with the barbecue, as Reb Zalman would say. So that was what they did, and they put the animals onto the altar. And look, everybody on your sources at source number 1 on the TV. And Aaron lifts up his hands and he blesses the people. And he comes down from doing the chatat, the sin offering, the ola offering, the holy bolt offering, and the offering of well-being, of the peace offering, right? So in other words, these 3 technical sacrifices, all of them prescribed very succinctly, right, in the manual, Levitical manual. And Aaron and Moshe coming to the Ohel Moed, the tent of meeting. And then they go out, doesn't say what they did inside. And they blessed the people. And then the presence of Yireh Vavhe appeared to all of the people. That's verse 23. Verse 24. Vateitzei Eish Midifnei Adonai. And now a fire comes out from before Yireh Vavhe. It's also very interesting in Vateitzei in general in the Torah. If you look at just the study of Vateitzei Dina, Vateitzei is not always a great thing going out, but here it leaves God, Vateitzei, and it's a supernatural fire. It's not a fire from the fire pan. It's not a human fire. It's a divine fire. And it comes down and it completely consumes the olah and all of the fats that were there. And the entire people saw this. Vayaronu, and they start shouting. That's a very interesting verb in Hebrew. Vayaronu rina, like R-I-N-A, rina. It doesn't really appear in other places quite this way. It's kind of interesting. Is it they're shouting from joy? The word rina is usually used in a joyous context. It seems like they had an ecstatic, in the Platonic sense of ecstasy. They kind of leave their bodies in a way. In that primitive way of understanding unity of consciousness, they blows their circuits. Vayit blew up at him and they fall on their faces. So this is a good moment, right? This is like if you had planned, if you had like you're a director and you were writing the script and you're in the Torah, you're thinking, this is going to be a good moment, right? It's almost analogous, like one day Romemu rebuilt this sanctuary and they would find the money to rebuild and renovate the church across the street, and they were in a harmonious relationship with the West End Presbyterian Church, and we decide like after 3 years of rebuilding, and that church across the street becomes this remarkable orchestral hall. It becomes an amazing music center for the Upper West Side, and there's prayer there, and there's Christian prayer, and Jewish prayer, and Sufi prayer, and all this kind of prayer. And we have a week-long celebration, right? And then it's all awesome, and then we are singing, and then it's like something supernatural happens. I don't know. The rabbi gets levitated. I'm like about 5 feet off the ground, and there's a halo of light comes down and streams through these beautiful ecumenical, windows, and the whole place is just like, it starts whipping it up. It's just amazing, right? So this is a good moment. And it's in this context that the next verses have to be understood, right? In the context of the next verses, of these verses, that the next source will have to be read. So source number 2 is the beginning of chapter 10. There are verses between there and then, but anyway. Vayikhu b'nei Aaron Nadav v'Avihu, ish machtato. Source 2, and now Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aaron, they're named the sons of Aaron. We already know that they're the sons of Aaron, but they're called this here, before they're even named, they're actually, their relationship with their father is prominent. Right? It's not even Vayikhu Nadav and Avihu b'nei Aaron. Right? It's not, and Nadav and Avihu, who are the children of Aaron, took the children of Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, each machtato, each one their own censer or their pan. A machta is a pan. Vayitnu bahen eish, and they put fire into the pan. Vayasimu la ketor, and then they put ketor, which is like incense. Vayakrivu b'nei Adonai eish zara, they brought forward an eish zara, a foreign fire, a fire that is zar or strange. Asher lo tziva otam, that was not commanded of them. And then verse 2 here, which is almost exactly like the previous verse, chapter 9, verse 24. Here it's Vateitzei eish milifnei Adonai. And now a fire also comes out from before Yud Hey Vav Hey, Vatochalotam, and eats them. It doesn't say and kills them. It does that in a minute. But first it says and ate them. Vayamutu lifnei Adonai, and they died before God. So before we get to any questions about this, let's look at some of the ways that the tradition has struggled with this or has made sense of this, right? So very early on, first of all, I want to say that before we get to 10th century Rashi, or 10th century Rashi, who's going to quote earlier sources, let's look at the Torah itself, internal to the Torah, how the Torah understands this moment. I want to argue, as I've argued in past years, that this is the most traumatic moment, more than the Egel Hazav, more than the golden calf. This is more traumatic in the Torah's own psyche. And one of the ways that I know that is that the Torah repeats this story 4 times. I mean, Freud wanted to talk about repetition compulsion, or about the homeostatic relationship of the organism towards its own health, and repetition as an opportunity to heal itself. It's read as a cautionary tale in 4 different places, but it repeats itself in such, it's almost like the Torah as grieving parent for these 2 children repeats itself in moments of, like, it just says it, it's in a context, but it's like, it's not necessary for it to say what happened to them. It could just say that they died, but it says that they were taken by God, almost like a grieving parent who says in some kind of reverie, and before she was taken, she was taken. It's like an internal struggle to make sense of this moment, right? Potentially. Again, it's not necessarily true, that's just my own contention. But look at the sources. The sources are really remarkable. So let's look at source number 3. From Rashi, who's going to quote an earlier source. Vateitzei eish, Rashi here, source number 3, says, Rabbi Elazar Omer, Rabbi Eliezer said, Lo metu b'nei Aaron, the sons of Aaron did not die except for al yedei shehoru halacha b'fnei Moshe. They were sentenced to death because they rendered a halachic decision in the presence of Moses, their teacher. Rabbi Yishmael Omer, Shtuyei yayin nichnasu lamikdash. Rabbi Yishmael said, no, they were drunk when they went into the Holy of Holies. Teda, how do I know that? She'achar mitatan yizhir ad notarim shelo yichnasu shtuyei yayin lamikdash. I know this because the very next moment in Torah, out of nowhere, God decides to tell Aaron that in the future you are never allowed to come into the Mikdash, into the holy sanctuary, having drunk wine or in a state of intoxication. So Rabbi Shmuel says, I see from that juxtaposition of those parshiot, from the flow of the narrative, that the only reason why God must be now reminding Aaron or telling him for the first time that you can't be drunk is because his children must have gone into the Holy of Holies in a drunk state. Mashal Melech, it is a parable to a king. Shayalo ben goes into the Mashal. The parable here is about a king who's prince, right? And here's the Vayikra Rabbah source, in source 4 that he's working from. They're working from, rather. And essentially, this is the general thrust of those who see Aaron's children as sinful. Right, so there are a number of different schools. One school of thought is that they were disrespectful towards Moses. They had taught in front of Moses, and therefore they deserved to die. Another school of thought is that they were intoxicated. Another school of thought says that they had not yet had children, as later on in the Torah it says that when they died they did not have children. They had no inheritance. They had no descendants, and so they had sinned in not fulfilling that mitzvah. So we can call that whole school of thought, the school of thought that, like I said last night's sermon, like Job's like Job's friends, like the story of Job, where Job is suffering immensely, and the friends come along and they heap insult onto injury by trying to tell him that it's his fault that he's suffering. We'll call this the school of thought, the justification of God and Torah school of thought, right? Alice Miller would call this like the way that the system always colludes to make the parents perfect. God is always perfect, the Torah is always perfect. We'll call that line of thought. And we don't have to put it down. We understand that if you begin with the premise that everything in Torah is just, and everything in Torah is beautiful, everything in Torah is from God, and there can't be anything in it that is, antithetical to our own mores, that kind of thing, then of course you're going to stretch yourself to find reasons to blame Nadav and Avihu. And sure enough, it's hard not to argue that this is, on the level of the Torah itself, at least at first glance, what they did is probably punishable. Because death, generally speaking, in Torah is not like a good thing, right? So on some level, internal to the Torah, it kind of makes sense to try to find a reason. Now, one simple reason could be, and which we didn't offer here, which is that the Torah itself seems to give us a reason why they were punished, right? Without all of these stretchings. What seems to be the internal reasoning in the Torah? Like we just read these verses. What do the verses say? They brought an Eish Zara. They brought some kind of foreign fire, Asher Lo Tzivah, that wasn't commanded. So on a cautionary level, without getting into the rabbinic stretching here, the cautionary tale is, hey, like that's the Holy of Holies. Like you can't just make it all up and just decide to do, like you can't do that. That's not allowed. Like that's a dangerous thing to do. That's just like internal to the Torah. That seems to be what the Torah is saying. But why do you think the rabbis, like, what's the problem with that simple understanding of the text that leads the rabbis here in the school of let's justify everything, there must be a reason for it, let's blame the kids and they must have done something really stupid? Why didn't they just seize on the simple meaning of the text? Why do they have to come up with they were drunk? There's another opinion that says that their clothing was frayed when they went into the another. What do you think is the rabbis are internal to the text? What do you think, Nikki, the rabbis are having a problem with?
Well, I hope I'm not speaking words.
Nikki, I'm going to be really clear because I'm going to get to anybody here who thinks that we're going to leave this story without morally, troubling the waters and coming up with alternatives. You don't have to.
I think it's a horrible story.
Great, I got that.
And
me too.
I see God is evolving in the Old Testament.
Yes, so we're going to get to that later on.
Yeah,
I want to get to the God evolving theory.
And I think that people who discard the Torah altogether could cite this and say this is a horrible
story on every level. So we're going to get there. Let's just for a moment listen deeply to the rabbis whose opinion we might reject and find problem with. Let's try to understand why they didn't think necessarily that the text described the full extent of their quote-unquote offense. Yeah, Tomas.
Within the context of the Shabbat of the child and being conscious of the uses and abuses to which children are put, this pattern of saying, oh, if only I hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened, that's the classic thought pattern of the abused child who wishes to sustain the illusion of control. If my garment hadn't been frayed, I wouldn't have died. And so the rabbis in this position, I think, are interestingly in the position of the abused children.
Of course.
And I don't know what the next step of that interpretation is, but just within the context of this weekend, that's an interest.
I love it. So within the context of this weekend, which we'll get to more in a moment, I just wanted we'll graduate from these perspectives into a different perspective. So let's just, simply put, the text seems to be telling us that God ate them, as it were, as an offering. And it seems that the language of the text, which leads the rabbis to try to figure out what they might have done wrong, is intention. Like there is a certain theory that these children were actually an offering in a world where righteous individuals were sometimes a kapara, an atonement, in a certain vision of, there's a certain philosophical stance within Judaism that the righteous who pass away innocently are a kapara, an atonement for the generation. I'm not defending this theology, I want you guys to be able to be emotionally distant for a moment from how much this text might bother you, so you can learn something about Jewish thought over the last 2,000 years before we land in our present 21st century. So there is a notion in the Jewish canon, and I hope I brought this text. I'm not sure that I did. I wish that, I know that we had seen it together, Rabbi Diane and I had seen it together, but I don't know if we.
It's at the end of Parshat Kav.
It's at the end
You
of.
can bring it up right now if you want to.
I could find it, but I could just tell it to them out loud.
Yeah,
Let me
you
just tell it
can do
to
that
you.
It's very crucifixion.
It's very
crucifixion related.
It's very Christian, and I want you to hear it because it is a part of our tradition. You might not like it, which is okay, but just listen to it for a moment because it's there. There is a vision of the rabbis of the notion that is like taken up by Christians in Christological thinking that human beings can stand in, as it were, and in giving their lives as either martyrs or as a source of an offering. You have this very early on in rabbinic literature with Isaac, that Isaac himself, and the binding of Isaac. There was a notion that Nadav and Avihu, right, and the parallelism between the ecstatic acceptance of the offering in chapter 9 and the exact same language being used for Nadav and Avihu in chapter 10 invites us to see them as an offering. Right, that they are, in some sense, God says, the reason why I'm taking them is because they will be a kapara for, some people say, for Aaron's sin with the golden calf, right, which is, of course, also problematic. Why should children die for the parents? Right, so, or that they're being offered because of the status of the Bechor, that Nadav was the firstborn, and so on. So just to hear that the rabbis, in trying to find another reason, are essentially working against the grain of the text and saying that they must have done something wrong because even if they would be a kapara, it's a punishment. We have to figure out what was their punishment, right? And the punishment is that it might be that they brought the foreign fire. It might be that they went into the Holy of Holies in a way that was inappropriate. It was a teaching from the future. Let's just hold this whole thing as an uncomfortable moment, either of rabbinic, like a rabbinic desire to make the indefensible, right, comprehensible. It could be the same psychoanalytic knee-jerk that I also agree with you, Thomas, that it's like when the abused one tries to find reasons so that they deserve to be abused. It also might be a part of, and again, the theology itself could also emerge from a very deep psychoanalytic place, right? It's not like the theology is immune to psychoanalysis. But I want you to know that there was a shift in that way of thinking about the sin of Nadav and Avihu into a place of that they weren't sinful, they were actually on a higher level, which also might be another version of what children do, the grandiosity versus the degradation. Like on the one hand, they deserved it. On the other hand, they were so special, that's why they deserved it, right? They were so special. And both of those are an extreme moment of being singled out. And look at this, if you can look at this text for a moment as a representation of that second school of thought. Now, I'll get to comments in a moment. The second school of thought, which is also extremely grandiose, the Or HaChaim is a 17th century Moroccan teacher, and he is following the footsteps of a much earlier source, which is Philo, which we'll get to in a moment. Lo nimna'u mikarov, he writes, as a mystic himself, he writes, Lo nimna'u, they didn't withhold, right? They didn't hold themselves back, mikarov, midvekut, mi'imot, arivut, ibidut, chavivut, chashikut, mitikut, ad kalot nafshotam. He writes in an extremely poetic form that they died because of the sweet, pleasant friendship, beloved, desired, sublime desire to be close to God. And what the death here is not a death by punishment, but a death by kiss. That they themselves were acting from the ecstasy, and they're building on Philo of Alexandria here in the sixth source. Look at Philo. Philo writes this, which is pretty amazing. And this is, again, this is the rabbis themselves in the Talmud do not adopt this. But look at what he writes. Nadav and Abihu in source 6 were not seized by a wild beast, but were taken up by a rush of fire, unquenchable, by an undying splendor, since in sincerity they cast aside sloth and delay, and consecrated their zeal, hot and fiery, flesh-consuming and swiftly moving, it's very erotic, to piety. This fire was strange to earthly existence, right? In other words, the strangeness of the fire, or it was not strange to God, it's not idolatrous, but it was strange to the corporeal human existence, since it belonged to the realm of God. Wafted by a favorable breeze and carried the heights of heaven, they were passed away like a holy burnt offering from the tabernacle into celestial splendor. It is thus that the priests Nadav and Abihu die so that they may live, receiving an incorruptible life in exchange for mortal existence and being translated from the created to the uncreated. Over them, a proclamation is uttered betokening immortality. Vayamutu lifnei Adonai, they died before God, that is, they came to life, so a corpse may not come into God's presence. So Philo reads this allegorically, and in a way that we would be like, whoa, that's Hasidic. Oh my goodness. And by the way, Philo in the first century is clearly, to call him Christological is kind of a bit, it's odd because, right, this is deeply Jewish, right, and deeply a part of the canon. And of course, it becomes, like in the tradition, later mystics in the Hasidic tradition take up Philo's mantle. And Nadav and Abihu become the ultimate paragons of Hasidic law breaking for the sake of God. Like they were on fire for God, so they broke through all the norms. Like didn't matter if you had to do this or that. Halacha, shmalacha. We want God, we want God, we want God. And that becomes the norm. And it emerges from a kind of grandiosity, a kind of these were special, unique ones. And both of them are in dialogue with the traumatic. They are both in dialogue with the shock and the unexpected. And in some way, they're holding a line that I would like to now today introduce a third approach, which will, I think, resonate with Nikki, with Lori, with our therapist, with Tomas. It certainly resonates with me deeply. And it's the kind of truth-telling that is also textually relevant. So let's look at the last source. I had other sources in here, but there's going to be a lot of dialogue, and I want to leave about a half hour for that. And this is taken from a site called Torah.com. And it's Professor Ed, I forgot to put his name here, to look it up. But this third approach, he basically goes through all of the things that we just saw in short shrift. He goes through all, I know about it, but I want to finish this and then I promise to come back. Because what happens often in our classes is that because we have such an involved community, the places that Rabbi Koresses and I often want to get to, but we want to take you through steps of the tradition, so you don't just walk out saying, here, my approach is the right approach. We want to hear the vast voices of our tradition before we arrive. And sometimes you guys are so advanced that you're already at the last source before we get there. And I kind of want you to see it in its flow, if that's okay. So here's the last source. Okay, here it is. So here's the last source that I wanted to share with you. So after going through the different schools of grandiosity on the one hand and degradation on the other, the schools that blame the victim and the schools that heroically elevate the victim, as it were, I think this is I think this is actually, quote unquote, the right reading, as it were.
Good words for a big rabbi.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for pointing that out, Tony. Yeah, and so I think these are the right. This resonated with me very deeply, and it also resonated because it was very deeply intertextually grounded. Like he's not just saying it knee-jerk. He wants to actually say something in the text that would be an indicator. He says, instead of looking at Nadav and Abihu who brought fire near to God or brought themselves near to God, a nice way of encapsulating the two approaches, we should be looking instead at God, God's self, at the deity. The classical rabbis suggest as much by pairing our parsha with the Haftorah taken from Shmuel Bet, 2 Samuel chapter 6, the account of King David's moving the Ark of the Covenant from its temporary storage outside of Jerusalem in Riyadh to Jerusalem, the future site of the temple. And that account has a remarkable parallel to our parsha. So let's look at that source together. Hard to move this if it's too far.
Yeah.
Oh, is it not here?
It is here.
The last source.
It's source 13.
Oh, there, source 13. Let's read this together. Chapter 6. David again assembled all of the picked men of Israel, 30,000 strong. And then David and all the troops that were with him set out from Baalim of Yehudah to bring up there the ark of God to which the name was attached, the name Adonai Tzvaot enthroned on the Keruvim. Verse 3, they loaded the ark of God onto a new cart and conveyed it from the house of Avinadav. Amazing, right? Sounds very much like Nadav and Avihu, like some combination of that name, right?
Wow.
And Avinadav's sons were named Uzzah and Achio, and they were the ones who were to guide the new cart that was holding the ark. They were traveling, they were like a moving company. They were taking the ark from Giv'ah to Yerushalayim, right? From Giv'ah to Yerushalayim. So they conveyed it from Avinadav's house on the hill. Uzzah was walking alongside of the ark of God, and Achio was walking in front of the ark. And meanwhile, David and all the house of Israel danced before God to the sounds of cypress wood instruments and lyres and harps and timbrels and sistrums and cymbals. I mean, it was a whole parade. It was an ark parade, right? But when they came to the threshing floor, right, of Nachon, Uzzah reached out for the ark of God and grasped it, for the oxen had stumbled. Everybody get that? Mm-hmm. Like the cart was, right, the cart had stumbled and the ark was about to fall off. And so in order to save the ark, Uzzah reached out his hand to keep the ark from falling, but God was incensed at Uzzah, and God struck him down on the spot for this indiscretion, and he died there beside the ark of God. Vayichar leDavid, and it angered David, asher paratz Adonai peretz Uzzah. It says that he was afraid, but really he got angry.
Yeah.
He was angry, right? I'm sorry, it says he was distressed, but really he was angry with God. Vayichar, he was angry with God, right? Wow. For God had been poretz, the word peretz here, right? Peretz means to breach. And Peretz, by the way, is of course one of the names, right? Peretz is the name of King David's lineage, right? Peretz was the child who breached Tamar's womb, and it becomes, we're called Ben Partzi. The Messiah is called the son of Peretz, the one who breaks forth. God has been the one who Peretz, here who broke forth, right? And that is exactly what angers David. Now, if you go back into source 12, and this professor who's looking at this story, and he says, instead of looking at Nadav and Avihu, let's look at God. And let's look at the brilliance of the rabbis who took the Haftarah, the part of Samuel, and put it together with our Torah portion to draw a parallel here. The ark was mounted onto a freshly made wagon pulled by a team of cattle. The procession was accompanied by great fanfare, and when along the way the cattle tripped and the ark was about to fall, Uzzah stretched out his hand to stabilize the ark and prevent it from smashing on the ground. And at once the deity exploded, parat, against Uzzah, slaying him on the spot. Uzzah had only the best intentions, but he didn't want the ark to crash. What did he do wrong? Nothing. Uzzah forgot that God does not tolerate any impingement by the impure on anything that is directly connected with the divine. God could not tolerate for a second the less than divine hand of Uzzah making contact with the Holy Ark, the seat of God's presence. We find the same concept at the sign of Revelation. In Exodus 19, Moses cordoned off the mountain lest God explode, right? The same word, God's explosion, and thereby kill any person or animal that encroaches on the mountain while the divine is touching it. right? We used to think of God as an always benevolent protector. But in one of the most prevalent conceptions in the Bible, God is a being who is wholly other, from a reality different from ours, as a scholar of religion, Rudolf Otto, described it in the early 20th century. This being is fascinating on the one hand and terrifying on the other. God is mysterium, right? Fascina et tremendum. God is, on the one hand, surrounded in mystery, and on the other hand, right, God is also terrifying. In this conception, God is not necessarily good and just in our terms. The way we might like God to be, God is an unpredictable and frightening power from another realm. It elicits our awe and wonder, but with whom we must be exceedingly careful. Uzzah, who tried to keep the ark from falling, forgot to be cautious in the presence of God, and so it seems had the young priests Nadav and Avihu when they brought forth their fire. The two stories have a curious connection in the Bible. The person who had been keeping the ark at his home in Gibeah is named Avinadav, a mirror image of the names of Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu. The man who tried to stabilize the ark, Uzzah, was Avinadav's son. And so the story of Nadav and Avihu is shrouded in the smoke of their incense. The smoke is dissipated to a degree by reading the Haftarah, relating the story of Avinadav's son, Uzzah, but the deity who lies at the heart of both stories, and several others in the Torah and Tanakh, remains a mystery. Now, another way of saying this might be that the only healthy, psychological, and Shabbat of the child worthy response to this story is protest. That if we are advocates for Nadav and Avihu as children, and advocates for ourselves in the face of the divine, and as King David was Vayichar, that King David got angry, the only maybe wholly accurate response to the story is neither seeing Nadav and Avihu as heroic mystics, a la Philo, Me'ashiloach, and all the great Hasidic masters, and not, on the other hand, to see them as blameworthy, a la Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yishmael. Rather, like this professor, to say that this text is yet another text of terror that we grapple with in our ever-evolving understanding of the theology of the Torah and its complicity in the way that we imagine tragic and traumatic events in the world, and where we try to offer like really flimsy explanations and interpretations that are offensive. We build a world where children and humans blame themselves for all manner of things that are they're unknowable, right? Cancer, whose fault is cancer, right? Is it the child at St. Luke's, St. Jude's? Whose fault is cancer? And on the other hand, we have schools of thought that say you bring it upon yourself to test you, your karma. That's how strong you are. God doesn't give you a test unless you're strong enough, which is in that whole school, right? Of, I think, misappropriated and horrible approaches to when bad things happen. And then in the other, cancer came because it's your fault. It's your diet. It's your past life. It's your this. It's your that. And I think that the juxtaposition of the Haftarah is a way of saying that the ultimate reality that we are in relationship with is also not something that we own. It's not something that we can contain fully. Another way of saying that is it's better to say, I don't know why this happened, than it is to say that I know. And that's vis-a-vis God sometimes. But when it comes to human beings, we have to name the horrific. Right? It's not enough to say that my father or my mother was a mystery. Like with human beings, it's a bit more possible to say that action was absolutely morally wrong, right? I think with time, I like for myself in my own story that I shared last night, I came to understand more deeply as I got older some of the societal reasons why I was abused or why those things took place in those camps that I was in, and I came to understand that and not excuse it, but some of the the unknowing was dispelled when I realized I could ask and go into it and say, oh, I wonder what were the constituent elements, right, that were the participating elements. So this is all a way of opening it up to all of you. We have about, I'd say, roughly 20 minutes. We're going to start in the room with all of the patient people who have been waiting. I asked all of you because we knew this, I knew that we all both knew that this is going to be a very hot and exciting topic, to be brief, right, and to be mindful of others who are also wanting to speak. We'll start with Batya. So Batya, Lori, Rabbi Koreses,
Very short.
and Wendy, and then we'll come back and forth. Okay, we'll do about 4 and then 4. We'll see. Go ahead, Batya.
So I believe that the Torah, the entire Torah, is a mixture of metaphor and reality. And in order that you will put all this together, that all the rabbis will have something to say, that we can think about what has happened and why it happened and so on, and bring forth new ideas. And that's what I think.
Thank you, Batya. Yeah, simple, good. Lori.
So I would take, there's 2 points I want to make. One, you said the mystery and the terror, and then the relationship of trauma healing, because there's good and there's evil. And there's the mystery and the terror, like someone asked last night, why does someone become a perpetrator to sexually abuse? And so what I want to address is the mystery of the perpetrator-victim dynamic. Like I said last night, the perpetrator was once a victim. And in my own personal life, my father divorced my mother when I was 16 and went to Grinnell College. But my brother was left with my psychotic mother because my father was too ashamed that she would have committed suicide. But my brother ended up dying on Passover at the exact moment of the crossing of the sea. And so the second point I want to make, that his soul chose to die at that moment of time when I couldn't get a rabbi. That's when he died. But Gabor Mate and Tirsa Firestone will both say that the vulnerability of those people in the prisons and in the jails, that the vulnerable people in our society are the ones that are being sacrificed and carrying the wounds of the traumas of Gabor's message, which is the myth of normal, that we think we're a normal society. But the truth is we don't face pain and we don't look at trauma directly because we're terrified. And the myth of trauma is the Demeter Persephone, not the myth, it's the myth of looking directly.
Yeah.
We can't look directly.
Right.
That's why people get scared of me, because I talk directly,
Yeah.
because my
That's one of
brother's
the 10
there.
reasons, by the way.
One of the reasons is because I'm too direct.
Yeah, well, I don't know, we'd have to ask people if they're indeed scared of you, because that couldn't just be a perception, but with that, we'll be that as it may, we'll leave that for a moment. Just thank you for the gift of your personal story.
Yeah, thank you for.
And thank you for the gift of every year, and those of you who don't know Lori, who was a trained therapist and trained specifically in the work with trauma, always brings you always bring the frame and the prism of speaking about, like, bringing things up and surfacing them and making them visible. And so you're essentially saying that in the mystery and terror of Rudolf Otto's idea of God as both mysterious and terrible, you're also saying that that also is true of trauma itself, that there's a mystery that we want to dispel, and there's a terror right around it that also can be dispelled when we see it more clearly. And you also added a number of other pieces about who are in our society are the ones who are trauma. So thank you for that, and thank you for honoring others. You have so much, and appreciate the tzimtzum on Gibur Shebegibura. I think we went from there to Rabbi Koreses and then Wendy.
So I want to speak to another possible source of rabbinic anxiety here. So they're looking at these words, H Zara, strange fire, and which wasn't commanded. And the whole rabbinic enterprise is sort of to go beyond the Torah and really to breach the Torah. So I'm wondering, you know, their laws breach the Torah in so many ways, and I'm wondering if part of their anxiety was like, wow, was this commanded? Like, is the rabbinic Judaism that we've created, was this commanded? And I think it's an anxiety that we deal with in a renewal synagogue. You know, I went to a halachic seminary and grew up in a halachic community. And now that I'm in a different sphere, there's a lot of anxiety about the Eish Zara, about the strange fire. So they may have needed to make Nadav and Abihu wrong because they're saying, oh, that's not us. We're doing something different. A shared siva otanu that we were commanded.
So interesting. I don't know if people track with that. I mean, it's hard to hear with the air conditioning and everything, but Rabbi Koresses was adding and elevating potential other source of rabbinic anxiety, meaning the rabbis who sought extra textual reasons for their sin, even though the text seems to clearly indicate that their sin is that they were not commanded. So then maybe what was really up for them is that, like Nadav and Avihu, they themselves felt that they were creating a Judaism that itself was not commanded in order to distance themselves from, oh, we're not like Nadav and Avihu, we're actually doing what's commanded. They had all these other ways of imagining it. That was a brilliant insight, and it's fascinating also on the head level, not just on the heart level, but on the head level, to think of other versions of Tritza, like Jewish renewal and liberal, like why did
What strange fire?
Right, and why did the Hasidic masters though valorize them instead of going the way of the rabbis? The way that the Hasidic masters dealt with their own anxiety is by owning Nadav and Abihu and saying,
model,
like,
right?
this is our model, like, you know, like,
Yeah.
so they, you know, depending on, anyway, so yeah, we have all of that going on here, and indeed in last night's sermon, we talked about the other option here, which is that they didn't do anything. What they did was misunderstood, and even the text is misunderstanding them. Like I never thought about this before, but maybe God also has the overexcited amygdala. Right? Maybe God's own rage issues are like God can't contain God's self, and here God is seeing, like in Nadav and Avihu, like a moment of lest they be like me, right? And they're you know, are they the commander? I'm the commander. Or they can't, you know, like that moment. There's another. We could talk about this. Wendy, go ahead. Thank you. Brilliant. Yeah. Wendy.
The fact that God didn't just strike these two brothers dead and allow their bodies to be buried is very significant, and that their neshamas like had no chance because they couldn't be buried, and the fact that they were burnt to ash, and it was in a way of showing God not choosing the firstborn again. Like Isaac over Ishmael,
Yes.
Jacob over Esau, and so on. And then going.
Can you guys hear Wendy? Because I can see that she's not highlighted in the owl, so I'm just wondering if maybe you're not. You can hear her. Okay, I'm sorry.
And then so going forward, the kahuna is given to Aaron, and then again not again until Pinchas, and so. Eleazar never gets the kahuna, but his son does. But if the other two brothers hadn't died, Pinchas would have never been able to get the priestly anointment from God going forward.
It's yet another attack in that world is that sometimes, and it's not altogether untrue, like that sometimes these horrific traumatic events have a silver lining or a silver learning. That had it not happened, we would not, like, it's almost impossible to work, right? That point is not insignificant. I think it's a significant point that sometimes these horrific events do in fact pave a new road. It's hard to think about that though in terms of a moral calculus, like how would you weigh, like is it more important for Pinchas to become, anyway, so but still I recognize that,
Yeah,
that's certainly.
Even if God would have just struck the two brothers dead, whole, and the bodies would have been able to be buried, Pinchas still would have gotten
Well, the bodies are buried,
bodies
actually.
are carried out.
The bodies are then carried out, even though they're eaten. What's eaten is not clear because the bodies remain intact. So that notion that they were eaten, like it's really not, leads some of the early, like Philo and others in the earlier part of the first millennia said that it was their soul that was, like the death was that God ate their soul, so that's why their bodies were still there. Because in the text, you see that Moshe has to go get a couple of other characters to come and carry the bodies out. So, okay, so Shamati, Mama Shamati. Okay, I know it's so hard. Asher Chaim, Marilyn, David, and Jay. Go ahead. We go to the Zoom. A lot of hands.
I'll try to go quickly to get to my point. There are many studies that show that people really prefer causality over randomness. The mind rejects randomness and chaos, so we create causalities even when they don't exist. This can lead to a sort of a problematic theology that everything happens for a reason, capital R, part of God's plan. I believe that Genesis proves that God's plan is always being thwarted. Nevertheless, it leads to a theology of mipnei chata'enu galinu me'artzenu. We were exiled because of our own sins. I believe that is healthy when we're talking about personally me being responsible and for my own actions and looking for how my actions might have led to my own problems. Thomas, thank you, avoiding future disasters. But I find this theology repugnant when one person looks at another person's suffering.
Yes.
And therefore, I prefer a read of Nadav and Avihu as a story of randomness, deadly randomness. And I'm shaped by the JFK assassination and the Warren report that said a single bullet so that the story would be tidier. But here, we often come to this story with the assumption that one fire eruption lit the offerings on the altar and everyone was happy, and a second fire eruption killed Nadav and Avihu because God wanted to kill them, God forbid. I prefer to read this as a single eruption of fire, intended only to ignite the offerings on the altar. However, Nadav and Avihu tragically were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the same fire that was a cause of joy became a fire that was a cause of tragedy.
Asher, so I'm sorry, I have to interrupt you. So first of all, thank you for the concise doubling down on that randomness is something that we're not hardwired to enjoy, number one. Number two, that was, I think, the point of source number 12 and 13 together was to point out that God is like ultimately mysterious and to some degree random, and that theology is a theology that also doesn't fit in neatly with, like, it doesn't work for us. So the honest theology of a God who is unknowable, it runs up against our moral need for a God who is benevolent. And so in that tension between naming God as benevolent and just, which, by the way, you actually just did that by saying, God forbid, God would have killed Nadav and Avihu, and in saying that, you actually run against the simple meaning of the text. Like your desire to read this as something that, that was, an accident is itself a beautiful example of the lens that we'll go to try to ameliorate a God who is random and seemingly capricious. I mean, the text is in no way indicating that these were one fire, because Vateitze Eish happens there would be no need for us to repeat Vateitze Eish and to have and by the way, there's also 5 or 6 verses between the first instance of fire coming out of heaven and the second moment. And so you'd have to, I understand you'll do some kind of textual, exegetical, but it's not the pshat of the text.
Sure it is. It's a pshat of the text.
Right, okay. So then
Vateitze Eish, meanwhile, back at the ranch, remember that Vateitze Eish? Meanwhile,
Asher lo tziva'otam, though, would be also...
So it was they were responsible for being in the wrong place at the wrong time by not following the everybody out of the Mishkan because fire is coming down.
Okay, so again, either way, your point is really, really well taken. Thank you.
Methroin,
I'm sorry, Marilyn has to go. We got to go to Marilyn.
Okay. Well, I love the pairing of the story of King David, and the other big pairing is that Acharei Mot, after the death, of course, is the high holidays where you have the 2 brothers, Ishmael and Isaac, that are saved because we have a compassionate God. And were also at that time saying, look, if you do everything good and everything right and take care of all of your sins, etc., then God is going to let you live another year. There's almost this kind of thing happening. And then by the time you get to Yom Kippur, it's, well, maybe not. It goes even beyond punishment. It goes our belief that if we do everything good, well, anyways, you know where I'm going with this. So I'll just stop then, because I think, just that same idea, held at the high holidays, that we don't understand how life works, but we know that it sure doesn't play out the way, in a just way all the time, like cancer, etc.
So I just want to underscore Nikki's point from about, I think it was almost an hour ago, or no, it's a little less, but maybe 45 minutes ago. And I promise to come back to this. And I think that it also is evident by what Tomas began with, and it's also evident in what Asher Chaim just spoke to. What we're dealing with is an evolving tradition whose both morality and theology are trying to be in lockstep with each other. And in a way, I brought these texts today as both an overview of the profound ways that our tradition has been adaptive to the burgeoning and new sense of what theology can and should be, and also to see the vestiges of that old world view, but also to recognize that even within our own current, in New York City and in America and more broadly, it's easy to live in an echo chamber where you think what's obvious to you theologically and psychologically is obvious to everyone. And it's not the case. It's just not the case. I mean, even for some of you who are bristling at the notion that when Marilyn was speaking about how later on in the book of Leviticus, where we have Yom Kippur is written within the context, the Yom Kippur rituals in the context of the death of Aaron's children, some of us are theologically thinking, no, that's not my theology either. Like what Asher Chaim said, I don't believe that God is opening up books and deciding on who's going to live and who's going to die based upon whether you're a good boy or a bad boy, or a good girl or bad girl, or a good person or bad person in that way. That's no longer our theology. And I think if you feel that way, you're not alone. There's a strong community of liberal, progressive Jews, and even those who are more, conservative in their practice, whose theology is also a little bit more, I think, without saying it arrogantly, more advanced and more morally and ethically resonant with us. But these vestiges are there. They make up part of our own psyche. And I really wanted to lift up the professor, I forgot his name, Ed, if you look it up on Torah.com, Ed Rosenthal, Ed somebody, and also King David. What emerges from here is King David got angry at God. And I think that there's some holy anger here against, that is part of the moral evolutionary process, where you say that doesn't speak to me, and not only is it not speaking to me, it's offensive. It's offensive, which would then lead us to a broader conversation about why we read texts that are offensive, but that would have to be a much longer course, on why we would read texts that we find morally offensive and so on. What's the moral justification of that? But I'm going to go last 2 points to David and then Jay in the Zoom. What about back here? David and Jay, we did 4 and 4, Tony. Don't worry, it's nothing personal. 4 and 4, it's just a pattern. 4 and 4. Go ahead, David.
The Shabbos. Maybe in part, I'm responding to what you just said. I think we continue to read these texts because perhaps we collectively are the abused child, and others have said this. And God is the abuser. And why is it that we continue to struggle so much to maintain this relationship? And is it possible that we continue to reify and maybe even fetishize Torah because in our state of victimization, both historically and by God, we're incapable, we're blind to the possibility that the Torah as it's been presented to us is irredeemable. There was historically an attempt to fix it, and that was Christianity, and to imbue Torah with the idea of a loving God. It had failed, I think, miserably. And so the question is, can we create a God that is divine, not divine? And can we do that from a place where our eyes are wide open and we're no longer the victims of that abusing God?
Amen. So as you know, as a friend and as a student of mine, you know that the book, maybe one of the books that had maybe the most impact on my deciding to come back to Jewish life was Facing the Abusing God by Rabbi Dr. David Blumenthal out of Emory University. And I've spoken about this at length about the point you just made. And I think that as a humanist, as a mystical humanist, which is what how I classify myself, as a mystical humanist, I think that there is ultimately the failure of Christianity in the 2nd century and then beyond it is actually, we might as well just say that the projects that began in the 2nd century, whether it was Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, or Christianity, were each a midrash, trying to evolve the Torah to some extent, to one extent or another, and the ever-evolving rabbinic approach that can either be cast in the light, as you said, of the child who's unable to act like this was Alice Miller's approach. He said any attempt to revitalize or rehabilitate the parent was itself part of the fantasy bond, Robert Firestone called this the fantasy bond of the child, right? Every time you think the only healthy response should be to completely walk away. They were abusive, horrible, all of those things. And she railed in later books against those whom she said she thought were still caught in the fantasy bond and were trying to save their parents. And she had that metaphorically and allegorically moving at many levels of the systems. And in your argument, you're also saying a similar thing. And I've had this debate with others and myself for many years. Is the reading of these texts a continued slipping in of my desire to save my dad, my mom, Judaism, God, whatever, and that's why we keep reading them? And there's another approach, which is that there would be no way to create a contiguous relationship with our ancestors and the things that they venerated, were it not for the fact that we continue to do what they did on some level. But what we have is what we just did for the last hour and 40 minutes, or whatever, an hour and 50 minutes. We have the ability to call out a text, to reinterpret it, to look at it and say, this doesn't speak to me, and I reject it even as I read it, and I gloss it with my own voice and my own midrash and my own expression of moral perspective. And in that way, we don't save that God from having to evolve. That God can die. And we're like, okay, that God's dead. But what we honor is our deep humanistic need to have a contiguous religious tradition, to be part of a lineage that dates 2,500 years and older, to read these texts, and then also to do what Rabbi Kolarski was speaking to, the rabbinic move of King David, like to get angry, and then to undo it. And the rabbis had the audacity to say that when we do that, it's as if God then begins to laugh, and God says, you are now saving me in that way, right? You're helping me evolve. And that's, in some sense, I think, a response to King David segment. Last person, Jay, and then we got to go, but then we'll have more during our open up today at 11 o'clock. Go ahead, Jay.
Yes, I whenever possible, I try to stay with the shot as long as I can. And it's a problematic shot, but 10:1 simply says there was Aish, and somehow that Aish got transformed to Aish Zara. How did that happen? Well, the text is clear. It's because Asher Lo Tziva, God did not sanction it. And it's an echo of the golden calf. The sin of the golden calf was that it was a ritual, some kind of sanctified moment that was not sanctioned by God. Now, how do we make sense of it 400 years later? Well, a lot of us go psychological as I do. I'm wondering if it's not also political, because if this is all about sanctioning and unsanctioned, the question I think for moderns is also who has the power to sanction? Who's sanctioning? Are we following? At what peril, etc.? So I just kind of wanted to throw that in.
So there's a lot of Torah on this. There's a lot of Torah, again, as I said, some saw Nadav and Avihu as being the ultimate reformers. They were doing something for the sake of God. Their intentions were good. and others, and I think that there are a lot of ways to read this. On a day called in the Omer, which is Gevura Sheba Gevura, about the importance of boundaries and the importance of even in ecstatic moments. You know, it's pretty easy to read this text I think in a psycho-spiritual way. I mean, in Romemu, in the first 15 years of Rome, I can't tell you how many times I used to say that whatever gets stirred in Romemu needs to be stored. Every service has to have a stirring and a storing. And that often what was stirred would often not be stored, but spilled. And it would become ecstasy that people wouldn't know how to ground that joy or that good feeling. And it could lead to breaches in boundaries, misunderstandings of body language, and like energetics that were then not properly contained. And there could be an ethical and moral breach of someone else's, I didn't want that hug, or I didn't want, what's going on. There are ways to read this that are, of course, very instructive about human experience. And that doesn't, I think, take it out of the various ways that we struggled with it today. So I just want to thank all of you for being oskim b'Torah. You really got in, and you waited, you spoke, you protested, you agreed to not have your voice heard for now, but to hear it later. There's a lot of Gevura Sheba Gevura happening. And so I want to say Yasher Koach. Chazan Basi Schechter, shifting gears to someone who just brings a smile to all of our faces, is going to be upstairs leading Tefillah this morning, which is super exciting. And I'm hoping you'll stay either online or come in or stay in for our Open Up this morning, which will explore this entire theme from a different perspective. Together, Rabbi Diane Kolassis and I will be doing that. And we thank you to Gil and thank all of you online this morning for being present for our learning on Shabbat the Child. Asher Kochachem. Asher Koch, everybody.